Hey, welcome, by the way, to Podcast Uno. Everybody, we're in the Aatmunn Innovation Lab right now. I'm Corey Welch here with Aatmunn, and our mission is to enhance the lives of over 2 billion frontline workers across the globe. 2 billion, that is 1/3 of humanity. And today, what we're going to focus on is really the critical aspect of that mission, ensuring safety of warehouse workers. Warehouses are bustling hubs of activity as we know it. You have fulfillment centers at Amazon and Walmart. And we're talking millions of square feet of safety measures that need to be covered. And they're vital to our economy. Yet they come with their own set of significant risks. And from dangers of forklift operations to the simple yet potentially hazardous act of walking across the warehouse floor, we're here to tackle these issues head on. So today what we're going to do is we'll uncover a few things. Number one, we'll get to know Doug Matthews. We'll talk about some of the startling statistics behind warehouse injuries and really the direct impact they have on workers and businesses alike. We'll take a closer look into really the most common hazards within the warehouse environment, including forklift incidents, slips, trips, and falls, why addressing these risks are not just a regulatory matter, but really morally imperative. And then maybe we'll hit some practical strategies and tools to mitigate those risks. I know, Doug, you're an expert in this field. And towards the end, maybe we'll introduce the Safety Inspection Manager, which is a great app originally developed 3M. This is an application that has been around for 6 or 7 years, a lot of R&D behind it, and is now part of Aatmunn's Innovation Lab. And we're really hoping that we can use this application, this podcast, to help transform how safety is managed in the workplace. So, Doug Matthews, welcome to the Innovation Lab podcast.
Yep, and good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You'd asked a question the other day and we were talking, and you'd asked me, what is your definition of safety? And so I'm going to throw that back at you. What is your definition of safety?
Yeah, I think when you think about what safety is, a lot of folks probably think about it as preventing injuries, which is at its core what you ultimately want to do. But safety goes beyond that. It's about managing risks, right? So it's about, when you go into a work environment, go into your home environment, you manage risks, so if you have spilled fluids on the floor, you clean them up because that's a slip potential. You do that in your house, you do that in the workplace, etc. So it's really about risk mitigation and the steps that you can take in order to drive that risk down so it doesn't turn into an outcome.
Got it. So your background is steel, right? You've been in, I guess we would call it the warehousing space. I'm sure there's plenty of warehouses across U.S. Steel. Walk us through kind of your journey.
Well, when you were kind of doing your kickoff comments and you talked about this being the first podcast, one that area that is pretty common, not just in manufacturing, but across a wide range of verticals, is warehousing. To your point, if you make a product, then you ultimately have some type of warehouse. You may actually have multiple intermediate warehouses when you go from one step of a manufacturing process to the next step of a manufacturing process. And then the whole way for the product to get transported over to the end user, there's intermediate warehouses. So you have distribution centers and fulfillment centers and, even within port facilities, things that come in on vessels, get maybe separated in warehouses and distributed from there too. So there's warehouse is a pretty common type requirement for a wide range of verticals.
Got it. And, there was one statistic that I saw, OSHA, the average warehouse across the U.S., not granted there's warehouses and big warehouses, but the average warehouse that is in existence today has an average of 454 citations worth of $1.8 million. Warehouses and storage facilities. The majority of these citations involve misuse of forklifts and non-compliance with hazard communication standard for chemical safety. So I kind of want to dive into forklifts. You think like forklifts, and then you go to Home Depot and you see these forklifts operating, and it's just like one guy, right? And they have it roped off. Why are forklift incidents and citations so why is it such a big issue in warehouse?
Well, I mean, think about the utility of what a forklift does, right? It allows you to move, pallets, large components fairly efficiently. They're designed to be able to navigate in relatively tight quarters. So they're the ideal tool, if you will, in most warehouses. Oftentimes, you have fork trucks that are operating in close proximity around people. You have fork trucks that have some type of a compliance schedule to get equipment loaded onto the mode of transportation in or out of the warehouse. There's oftentimes kind of a time component, that feels pressured to speed up, if you will, to make your lift faster, to kind of be able to expedite, the shipping process. And there's a heavy involvement, with the human component and how, the human operates the piece of equipment, in the warehouse. So there's a wide range of hazards operating in close proximity to equipment, to inventory, to people, interaction with overhead cranes, interaction with inbound, outbound rail trucks. So there's a high degree of activity, and it's hard to really kind of build in protective barriers to separate activities because they have to interact with each other.
So you said a lot of cases there's pressure. So where's this pressure coming from? Is this leadership? Like what does that journey look like? Like why is there so much pressure?
Yeah, I mean that really depends on the organization. I know that one, you have a business to operate, and the activities of a warehouse is to take and transition material from one location to another location. So you have to move things. Oftentimes, a fork truck is the mode to be able to do that. There may be pressure to quote get certain volumes of material on a particular shift. There may actually be incentives that employees are paid based on the number of trips and loads that they make. So there's a variety of moving parts there that create that kind of that urgency, that pressure, if you will, to go faster.
So incentives, I mean, is that kind of a widely adopted practice, incentivizing loads for a forklift driver?
Yeah, I would say that could be pretty widely accepted. I mean, again, the goal is to move things, right? And oftentimes, building it in as part of an employee compensation is a common practice in order to reward the employee for performing, say, exceptionally on a shift and encouraging that behavior.
Interesting. So who's tracking these loads, and is there technology out there that tracks like that you tie into these forklifts? Like how does that even track?
Well, I think one measurement could be how many trucks get unloaded per day, or how many trucks get loaded per day. Because ultimately, it's the goal is to try to move your inventory to your customer, or if you're receiving inventory, into your warehouse, to be able to get it into the location where you want it to be. So I think it could be, a variety of different ways. But I'll say this, I think as a business, you want to maximize your productivity, but you don't want to compromise your safety. So most companies will put, certain safety rules in place, speed limits, stop signs, yield signs, flashing lights, restricted areas in order to minimize any impact that the fork truck operating at quote max efficiency doesn't compromise safety.
So I guess if you have all these protocols in place, I mean, we're talking 454 citations on average per warehouse. If there's these safety measures already put in place, how do you manage all that, right? And clearly something's amiss, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that, if you take a step back, one, you start with a hazards assessment. Companies may call it a risk assessment. Some may call it a hazards assessment. And so you actually have a formal structured kind of analysis of your particular warehouse. And there's a lot of commonality across warehouses, but there's also unique things in certain warehouses as well. So part of a hazardous analysis would be, what's the lighting? How well lit? How uniform is the lighting distributed around my warehouse? Once I have product in my warehouse, do I have dark spots? Do I have good visibility for my employees as well as the equipment operators as they're conducting their work as well? Blind spots. If I've got areas where I'm going to have mobile equipment and pedestrians that potentially could interact, or even mobile equipment and mobile equipment, interact? Do I have blind spots? And what cautions can I take around those blind spots to alert people to slow down, take some additional cautions so that you can mitigate risk? What type of activities are my employees performing? Is all of my loads being moved by mobile equipment or EOTs, or do I require some heavy lifting, awkward lifting? Maybe it's repetitive lifting. So what type of exposures does the employee directly have related to strains and sprains potentially? And then what's the exposure to sharp objects? So oftentimes there's some type of banding that goes on to pallets or materials that are being shipped out of warehouses. Are there sharp edges? When banding is removed, how is it disposed of? Is it left in the walkways, or do my employees having to walk over it? A variety of different kind of hazards related to that. And then you have the traffic flow, which can be a hazard that needs to be kind of planned out, right? So again, as we talked, we have fork trucks that are moving throughout the area. You have EOT cranes in a lot of cases that are moving through the area. You have trucks inbound, outbound, and what's that flow look like? And then you have the whole travel with EOTs potentially, and even suspended lifts when going over pedestrian areas, and how do you deal with those? And how do you permit trucks to come into the areas? Those are a wide range of, probably not all inclusive, but a range of the types of hazards that you have to deal with in most warehouses.
Interesting. I know OSHA estimates something like 70% of forklift accidents can be avoided. Do you think that's an accurate number? How do you estimate that as well? Right?
Yeah, I'm sure that data is pretty solid. OSHA reports, that you have OSHA logs that include the types of equipment that are involved in the incidents with or without injury. And I'm sure that's a reasonable statistic.
So what are these types of injuries?
So the types of injuries that occur, one might be struck against, caught between. Strains and sprains, lacerations, would be probably the most common injury types that would occur in a warehouse.
So, are we talking like somebody gets cut? You have to report that? Is that like, it doesn't have an impact, throw a Band-Aid on it? Is that something that gets reported?
Well, it meets the OSHA standard, right? So if it's an OSHA recordable injury, there's a standard that defines what constitutes, a recordable injury. And all companies are required to follow that. So, for example, if it's just a small laceration that doesn't require any type of prescription medication or sutures, for example, in most cases, that would be classified as a first aid. Most companies will actually keep that in their records, but it's not necessarily added to the OSHA log per se.
Interesting. Here's a stat. So the direct average cost to a company for a worker injury is $38,000, with indirect costs reaching $150,000. And I think we know OSHA fines are increasing every year, right? From $7,000 for minor infractions to up to $70,000 for repeat offenses. I think the average OSHA violation today is over $16,000 now. That's crazy. It seems like OSHA continues to increase the fine dollar amount, but 2.7 million people died last year from work-related injuries. It seems like the number keeps increasing. Why do you think that is? And is there something else that companies can do, right, outside? It seems like the dollar amounts aren't aligning. You see what I'm saying? Aren't aligning with the increase in deaths and work-related injuries. And maybe I could be off base here.
Yeah, no, I think those statistics are pretty solid. Where I start out with is just a core value. Safety is a responsibility that a company has to provide a safe work environment, and it's good for business, right? There's a lot of studies out there that talk about companies with good safety practices, perform well in a lot of their other key business drivers as well. So if you start with that, most companies really do care and they want to provide a safe workplace. However, these incidents can occur even at those facilities. And then there's companies out there that maybe just operate their safety program to be compliant and avoid fines. And that's their business choice to do that. But they're going to be the ones that actually would likely be the most frequently cited.
So, and obviously you have, these forklift incidents, but, there's musculoskeletal injuries that happen. And what is that? Just walk us through that. Like, we're talking improper handling or lifting techniques. Like, is there really a technique to lift a box? Like, are we talking about, some guy who's a little bit older who's getting hurt? Like, why is that such a big focus? Because I've seen plenty of technology and articles out there from obviously, back injuries, things like that. But, it seems like it's a pretty important topic of conversation. Like, what are some of the things that companies do to prevent those, musculoskeletal injuries?
There's a multitude of kind of administrative controls that you can largely do. They're ideally, transitioning from human lifting to some type of electromechanical device lifting is kind of an elimination of the hazard, which is the ideal kind of place to be. Some cases you can't do that. Sometimes you just have to, it requires some type of human movement of whatever the product is in the warehouse from one location to another. And so you can have, heavy lifting, which could be like just an overload situation. You can have awkward lifting, which may not be a real heavy load, but just based on your body position, it kind of strains, your muscles and can result in injury. And then you have the repetitive type lifting where, performing the same motions over the course of, a shift or multiple shifts or weeks or months can result in some type of chronic strain or sprain as well.
So it seems complex. So how do you manage that? Like as a company?
I think, the fundamental is, again, starting with the hazard assessment and then building out, your control actions around the hazards. Always, it makes best sense to get your employees involved, be able to sit down as a team, have a safety professional who has a trained eye. Maybe you have an industrial hygienist or an ergonomist who joins your team in order to help you with your assessment. And you make a list of all the risks. You build a risk matrix around, what types of injuries could occur and what's the impact and likelihood of occurrence. And then you put actions in place in order to try to, again, safety, mitigate risk, and either reduce the likelihood of occurrence or at a minimum, reduce the impact if it does occur. And you actually build out kind of a hazard plan that everybody's had input into, everybody has buy-in to, and then you go through a period where you remind people, through retraining and maybe daily contacts, or, you add some additional signage out in the area, or warning lights, painted walkways, things like that are common practices to mitigate risk in warehouses.
And so you mentioned training. I think that's obviously an important one. But I think a lot of times, you have these trainings, and every company experiences it, not just in industrial, but you have this training, and the outcome of that training, or at least your goal, is to change some sort of habit and behavior. But what is it called? The 10,000 hour rule, right? It takes 10,000 hours to change a habit or create a new one. I could be completely off base here. So, but you have this training, and how long are these trainings? An hour or two? And then what, right? So it's like, okay, we get everyone's buy-in, but then everyone goes back to doing their job. How do you ensure that companies, or I guess your employees, are actually acting on? I mean, is this something that's like, you just got to build guardrails? Because it's when you have 1,000 people in a warehouse, like, how do you absolutely ensure that everyone is acting on that training properly? Is it technology? Is it just systems and processes? Do you have a million, safety managers or specialists that are hanging around the warehouse? Because I feel like that can get pretty expensive. Like, what are kind of tools that companies use, or some of the practices that companies leverage today?
Yeah. So I'm going to say commonplace today is peer-to-peer, right? So a work crew that's out there performing the normal shift work in a warehouse, they can kind of remind each other of the training and kind of the procedures that they should follow. Warehouse operator can remind a fork truck operator that may be going too fast or encroaching upon a walkway or something like that. So peer-to-peer can work in a lot of locations and is fairly effective. Observations, so formal structured observations of shift supervisor of some sort performing an observation of a worker, and then kind of re-instructing the worker at the end, or even congratulating the worker on doing an exceptional job, can be very effective. Technology is emerging quickly. There's technology that's out there today that can real time assess the speed in which a fork truck's operating. You can put speed kind of governors on mobile equipment. You can actually do kind of based on data collected while a fork truck's in operation, critique, a fork truck operator's conformance to the safe job procedures a particular company might have. You can actually use kind of AI enhanced video to kind of observe actions that are being taken and then flag things that would be not following procedures properly and give you opportunities to re-instruct employees. So there's a wide range of kind of administrative controls and that are generally accepted. And then there's technology that is available today that can enhance that and take it to the next level.
So there's worker observations, there's these trainings. Does OSHA require those trainings and observations to be recorded somewhere? And if so, what's the real accountability on OSHA? I mean, you see fines if there's not, if companies aren't properly, recording these various training events and observations, or is it just kind of a generally accepted practice?
Yeah, I think OSHA requires that companies have appropriate training programs for the skills that employees are required to perform on the work that they do. So there's a wide range of obviously positions that are out there, and companies write job qualification training programs so that when an employee is newly introduced to a new job, there's a certain list of prerequisites that they have to complete that, quote, qualifies them to be able to perform that work. And oftentimes it's a blend between kind of procedure review, maybe there's video kind of supplements that enhance that. And then there's a high degree of mentoring or on-the-job training that takes place. And then there's an assessment to make sure that the employee performs, consistent with the training, usually at the end, and then they're certified. And then you have to maintain those certifications. So they require periodic refresher training, in a lot of types of positions. One that comes to mind is, a fork truck operator might be required to say have a medical physical on a periodic basis, maybe annually, and then complete a fork truck refresher training. So maintaining those certifications, maintaining records of those certifications, and making sure that the only employees that are being assigned to operate, a fork truck have those qualifications is a requirement that sometimes can be challenging to keep up with, especially when you have a large warehouse like you described, maybe 1,000, right?
So are companies just keeping this on their computer, like verifying that all these people have the right trainings?
Yeah, a lot of companies, have paper-based training programs, paper-based filing systems and certifications. Many companies have moved to some type of an Excel spreadsheet that they keep track. And there's actually some, boutique specialty training programs that are out there that can help with that. You still have the administrative burden of having to input all that into a system. But it can help you remind you when retraining is required, things like that. So there's probably a range of filing systems to digitized to some degree.
Yeah. So in terms of like hazard communication, you hear this often. It's like safety data sheets. I mean, what are these things? How are they used? And I guess why are they so important to an organization? Is there like a standard practice for each one of these safety data sheets that OSHA has on their website that you can pull? Like where do you get these things from? And I guess why are they so critical to safety? And that might be an ignorant question, but I'm going to ask it.
Yeah, no, so it's actually a really good question, and I think it's fair. There's material safety data sheets, MSDS, that is generated by usually the manufacturer of every type of, material or liquid, right? So what's the hazardous content of it is really what it describes, the chemical makeup of it. And companies are required to actually have those available to employees. At one time, they might have been in big 3-ring binders located out somewhere in an accessible area out on the shop floor. A lot of companies have transitioned to maintaining them digitally and giving employees access to, say, a computer in their work location so they can get access to them as well.
Is there any type of laws that companies have to follow that are, I guess, relevant to safety data sheets? Or is it, again, one of those things where it's like, it's generally an accepted best practice, right?
Yeah, I think it ranges. I think, there's some of the more kind of technology enabled companies probably have easier, say, digital libraries of these MSDS sheets that make them available. But there's probably companies out there still today that meet the standard by just keeping hard copy papers in a booklet and accessible. Those are much harder to keep track of and update and know when to refresh based on changes from the OEM and say some compound, or maybe switching to a different supplier, that you're buying. What are the hazards associated with that material that you're buying now can create challenges.
So tell me, I mean, so how do employees know that equipment is safe to operate? What does that procedure and process look like?
Yeah, I'm going to say most companies have very defined practices that require inspections. So, in most instances, like a fork truck, it's required to be inspected prior to use. So, employees, as part of their mobile equipment training, fork truck training, they actually are trained in what are the conditions that they need to evaluate prior to the start of the shift in order to make sure that the equipment will operate the way it's intended to operate. Oftentimes it's the status of the windshield, the status of the brakes, the safety belt, is it intact? A wide range of questions, and it's in a checklist format. And then the operator goes through and it's either pass or fail, yes or no. If there's conditions that need to be addressed, there's usually a section to be able to make notation as to what needs to be addressed. And then that gets put in, a folder where employees can actually make a request to have things repaired and not operate the equipment. Or if it's a clean bill of health, they just go about their day and start their work.
Wait, so this is something that is required every time you drive a forklift?
Every time. Every operator that has to operate a fork truck at the start of the shift usually performs an inspection. And then there's usually some type of mechanics inspection that gets performed on a periodic basis as well.
So, and how many, I mean, you talk about, I don't know, we'll use Amazon, for example, or one of these big retail giants, right? How many forklifts are we talking in a warehouse?
Yeah, it can range from, a handful to probably very easily in the neighborhood of, say, 100 to 200.
A day? And are all these things in operation daily?
If it's a 24/7 warehouse, they're going to, it would be on multiple shifts daily. So yes.
Multiple shifts daily. So we're talking hundreds of paper inspections?
Yeah, absolutely.
So walk me through that process. So I have, you just mentioned, so you have somebody that goes up to a forklift, they have their paper inspection, they grab it out of the, I'm guessing some sort of room. I'm thinking like old school, like stacks of paper. I'm just going to grab one of these off. I complete my inspection. I put it in a folder. I put it back in the room, and then I jump on that forklift and I operate it. That's
pretty much the way a lot of companies operate today.
It seems like a waste. It seems like a waste of time.
Yeah. So think about the challenges that create, right? And again, if you go back to the risks of being a successful inspection, so one, you have to trust that the operator will perform the inspection at the start of the shift to verify the condition of the equipment. You have to make sure that they're done every shift of every day of every week, and every week of every year, right? And so that governance process, requires audits. So usually, most companies will kind of verify, periodically they'll go through and do a safety inspection of a warehouse. And that might be one of the things that they ask to see, is kind of evidence that the checklists are being performed as they're supposed to. The other challenge that is with a paper-based system is being able to track the issues that are identified and make sure they get routed to the right person that can provide a competent follow-up to address that issue, and then close it out in the system and make sure it's been completed. So that whole paper trail of managing that process, it can be really challenging as well.
So let's say somebody's driving a forklift, right? They get hurt, right? Something happens. And now there's some sort of inquiry or audit, right? Or investigation that goes into that issue. I'm guessing the first thing you're going to look at, if there's some sort of issue or incident that happened, is you're going to go back through, are we saying stacks of paper or folders of paper, to make sure that forklift driver completed that inspection?
Absolutely, that is one of the first things you pull when you form an investigative committee to review and get to root cause. One of the very first things you're going to want to look at is what is the status of the inspections? Was there any deficiencies identified that weren't addressed? What is the condition of the piece of equipment? That's where you start out. Really, not just with fork trucks. It could be an EOT crane, it could be a jib, a wide range of devices that are used in a warehouse.
How, I mean, you got to think. First of all, outside of it just being a royal pain in the ass, right? I mean, time consuming, right? I have an investigation. Now I have to go back and retrieve this data, go back through each one of these sheets. I mean, I guess I would assume that oftentimes paper is misplaced, damaged. I mean, I guess it could be destroyed, right?
All of the above. I mean, I'm gonna say in most instances, people try to do the right thing, but sometimes folders get misplaced. Sometimes they don't get. Usually, they stay out in the field, for a week or two, and then they're put in an envelope and sent someplace else for storage and retention, to meet the OSHA requirements. But sometimes, there's just a breakdown, and inspections just stop being performed. And oftentimes people don't know that the inspections aren't being performed until you have an event like you just described, or you conduct one of these audits and you've already gone for a period of time when you're out of compliance and vulnerable. And to be frank, I mean, fundamental to a really good safety program is making sure your equipment is going to operate the way that you intend to operate it, which means that you have a checklist of some sort that identifies what are the critical things that have to operate exactly the way they're designed to be operated, and you have to verify through an inspection that that is the case. I've been involved in many incidents with and without injury where there were inspections weren't being performed, and we had to take corrective actions immediately for that.
Incredibly archaic. Incredibly. Well, I guess the other thing is I will call them real time updates and alerts. I mean, if there's some sort of issue, I mean, are those issues ignored? I guess it seems like we're playing a game of telephone to address one issue that could, I guess, potentially be avoided. And I would say the second part of that is, I mean, don't paper based systems put workers at risk?
Well, I think ultimately, if they're executed and governed and the way that they're intended to be, then I think you can mitigate those risks to the workers. The challenge is if you say for example, in one warehouse at one site, you've identified a root cause, and maybe it was the checklist didn't cover all of the items that you should have covered. You want to add something to it. So then you have to go back and you want to change that at all of the other warehouses that might be using that same checklist. You want to modify that to include that new question that you want evaluated.
See, that's interesting. You bring up a good point, especially for safety managers, right, that are overseeing multiple locations. You have to go to a physical location to do these assessments. It seems like that absolutely hampers effective safety management, right? I mean,
It's a huge challenge because I mean these forms for this inspection, they might the official folder might be like in the shipping warehouse, right, office area, but there's going to be instances where employees put them in their personal lockers. Maybe they're out in the field closer to the equipment that they're operating, so they don't have to walk all the way over to do that. So it's really hard to manage all that paper because it gets dispersed in a lot of different locations. And if you want to do an update, you got to track all those remote locations down on where that paper might be stored in order to get that updated form out there.
interesting. So let's say there's an emergency, seems like it's about as slow of a response as possible. Like in the event of an emergency, obviously quick access and quick response is critical to, saving lives, right? And if I'm thinking about paper systems, I mean, their inherent limitations in accessibility and speed. I mean, it could be make or break, right? It could be a matter of life or death. And I hate to say it, but it seems like, that slow response. I mean, every second counts in this game.
Yeah, I mean, in a well executed paper based system, there is an administrative burden. It does require time. You can maintain to be compliant with the OSHA standard, but it takes a lot of effort in order to stay on top of it to make sure that you're compliant.
So, so Doug, I guess this leads me to, my next question. Housekeeping and maintenance You got to think there's different areas that need to be inspected and verified that they're safe to work. Kind of walk me through some of those procedures and processes.
Yeah, so in most, I mean, you create a housekeeping standard, and most warehouses would have this standard. Depending on the type of vertical, what type of warehouse it is. I mean, this can range from, say aggregate material warehouses all the way up to, biomedical warehouses that are clean rooms, right? So you've got some very diverse standards for which you want to maintain the condition of the warehouse. So lighting is important, making sure you identify emergency exit signs and emergency lighting in the event of a power outage. You generally have some type of fire suppression, fire detection type equipment that might be located. You have probably some ladders that are positioned, around, a particular warehouse. If you're dealing with, you mentioned material safety data sheets. If you're dealing with some type of say a fluid or something in your warehouse that might require safety showers, eye wash stations, you have a lot of equipment that needs to be inspected on a periodic basis, and usually that's comprehended as part of what I would call a housekeeping inspection. So in addition to the housekeeping inspection, you have cords running across walkways that could be trip hazards, or you have hoses that are kind of run in areas where pedestrians might be moving and walking. You might have spills that occur, accumulation of water after a heavy rainstorm. A variety of things can be built into what you want to check at a specific frequency in order to maintain the general conditions of the warehouse, safe and orderly for the employees working there.
So you talked about a few things. From what I'm hearing, it's hazard management, it's compliance and regulations, it's training and development, it's incident reporting and analysis. I think all this kind of ties into kind of having a safety culture, right? I think that's a buzzword. So, but all of these processes insist, like we live in a world today where we literally have a system and process software for a system and process for everything, right?
Yeah.
There's a system and process for getting to work now. I mean, you have ways that will let you know when there's a police officer ahead, right? You have
or an object in the road, right? Yeah, exactly.
Or an object in a road that other people flag. And it seems to me, it seems crazy that you have these robust manual paper-based systems that are really complex with a lot of people in a closed environment, and they have to maintain and navigate manually, right? So I guess the question is why, and maybe I'm off base here, but you had mentioned a little bit ago that there's software and technology that's getting there. Why has it been so difficult for companies, A, to adopt software, and B, what are some of these pieces of software that are out there today that are trying to solve this problem? Because it's a problem. It seems it's a problem. I mean, and even if you don't think it's a problem, it's expensive because you need more people to manage these manual processes and systems. So I guess let's kind of lean into kind of the technology piece for a second.
Well, I think in a lot of cases that a lot of people don't know about the technology that's out there. I mean, I think it's been emerging in our personal lives. We live with it every day, but in the industrial workplace, I think it's been slow to kind of emerge into those particular areas.
And why is that? Why has it been so slow?
I think some of it is just trying to figure out what technology can be effective in an industrial kind of environment, and then what is the benefit that you can realize, by deploying it and embracing it. And I think the transition is happening now, but there's still folks that just haven't seen it yet. So I think the word of mouth, the marketing opportunities, being able to do a lot of peer-to-peer discussions around how technology has benefited particular warehouses is going to help build confidence that is the right approach going forward. And I think adoption is already accelerating.
Yeah, you obviously you see some of these, kind of, I don't want to call them rinky dink, but you kind of have these kind of highly niche checklist applications, right? And you have a checklist application that's just for incident reporting. You have an LMS application that's just for training and development. You have another application that can help you with understanding compliance and regulations or hazard management. But it seems to me that from a software standpoint, they're great niche solutions. They're almost like band-aids. But when you think about the whole worker, right, that entire worker, it seems like the opportunity for a software that centralizes, streamlines safety protocols, really making this kind of the core safety system upon which other, these four pillars: hazard management, compliance and regulations, training and development, incident reporting analysis, and just checklists rely upon. You really need something that automates that data collection, that simplifies that compliance training, that offers these safety managers a way to be able to assess the risks and measures of what's going on at multiple locations through one centralized hub. It seems to me like, an application like Safety Inspection Manager really is that full solution. And there needs to be, if I'm honest, there needs to be more kind of these centralized one, I don't want to call them one-stop shops, but, the centralized platform that a safety manager can use to manage not just one thing, right, but the whole worker, right, as a whole. I mean, that's, to me, it seems like should be the foundation. And maybe it's cost, right? Maybe it's subject matter expertise or lack thereof that's, I guess, preventing these adoption or these softwares from being built and created. But I guess the question I'd have for you is, talk to me a little bit about that, and talk to me about, I guess Aatmunn and, the platform that Aatmunn's built, and, maybe this safety management software, inspection software that, I guess, kind of solves that kind of centralized, streamlined whole worker, I guess, protecting that soul of the worker, not just an arm or a leg. I guess walk me through that platform and how, Aatmunn itself is trying to change kind of that these fundamental flaws.
Yeah. So I think when I think around kind of the platform and technology enablement, right? And we think about starting with the beginning of our discussion, where you really start with a hazards assessment, right? And how do you actually, once you assess the hazards, how do you mitigate the risk associated with those hazards so that you can avoid outcomes? And what are the types of hazards that exist? Struck by, struck against, caught between, right? Slips, trips, falls, equipment performing or not performing, right? Those can all be hazards. So there's technology that can actually easily be deployed around, alerting when, proximity detection between from equipment to equipment and equipment to pedestrians. So now technology is ready, enabled, ready to go into the industrial, or I should say any warehouse, and be able to help alert whenever encroachment is occurring. And it's not just about line of sight anymore. And everybody, quote, looking around, head on a swivel when you're walking through a warehouse, observing all the moving parts. Now you can enable technology to be that additional sensor that gives you alerts real time. So that's one. Two is be able to kind of manage the equipment and the physical conditions of a facility through a wide range of checklists that can be performed, maybe are being performed, but you can streamline that and simplify that whole process tremendously with an application like Safety Inspection Manager. The three modules that are kind of embedded, or the core competency of the Safety Inspection Manager, is asset inspections, and which includes all of kind of the fire extinguishers, the ladders, the below the hook lifting devices, the PPE that may be required to be worn in that area, the fork trucks, the EOTs. You can perform asset inspections. You can maintain records of employee certifications in Safety Inspection Manager. So at your fingertip, who's competent to operate, whatever the task is, who's been trained, whose certification needs to be refreshed, and when do I need to have that scheduled by. You can do observations of employees to know that they're performing the work that per the procedures that you want them to follow. And then you can do area inspections. So you can do that kind of that very at your fingertips, the area inspections to make sure the physical conditions don't contribute, to a safety incident.
To me, it seems like it comes down to data, right? And I think sometimes data is a general term, but if I'm a safety manager, I'm not as technologically advanced as, my kids. I feel like, sometimes software can get daunting, right? So in terms of the user experience, why there's been such a mass adoption of safety and inspection manager? And is that because of the user experience? Or does it have something to do with it?
I mean, when we talk about what are the biggest challenges with being able to perform inspections, one is, are they being performed at the frequency that you want them to be performed? And if they're performed, are the actions that are identified on the checklist being responded to like they need to be? Right. And then three is record retention. After the inspections are performed, am I getting them into a record retention system so that I can demonstrate compliance should I need to do that? And so Safety Inspection Manager simplifies that whole process. I mean, you can generate a report like for yesterday's required inspections, which ones were delinquent. So you could have a daily jeopardy report, you have a weekly jeopardy report, you have a monthly jeopardy report. You can define the frequency that you would like. You can compare areas very easily because now you've kind of have all the data that's kind of flowing into one location, so you can measure life cycle of equipment. Our housekeeping inspections being performed, what's being identified, whatever's identified, if it's deficient and needs to have maintenance address it, is maintenance aware that it needs to be addressed? Is it clearly communicated what the deficiency was? So even though a maintenance person shows up to go do a repair, maybe they go to a different part of the warehouse because it was, not clearly defined. So you got a picture that actually shows the deficiency that can make follow-up actions to be more effective. And then you close out the deficiency and you got a record of all of that life cycle that was completed. So it just simplifies that whole process and it's simple to use. That's what I love about it.
So walk me through that. So I guess, one of the nice things about SIM that you had mentioned is it seems like, the collaboration piece, right? It's not just kind of this single use per user tool that a safety manager uses. I can plug in my workers. I can plug in my maintenance team if there's some sort of issue to go and repair or replace a piece of equipment. I can see repair notes and history. It seems like the collaboration safety inspection manager it's certainly a differentiator. And I know there's great, pieces of software out there, but I personally haven't seen anything that is as collaborative as SIM.
Yeah, I think it really does do a lot, to kind of put the ownership in the hands of the people doing the work, which is really important in building kind of that culture around collaboration. And I think that it is one of the fundamental building blocks that can allow that to happen.
I think, to your point, companies that are operating effective paper-based systems, they run a pretty tight ship, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's also plenty of companies out there, especially with a lot of safety managers moving from company to company with turnover. It seems like somebody coming in with maybe a different system or doesn't have the ins and outs of the previous system can have difficulty making that transition, right? So maybe not for the companies that, have a safety manager has been around for 20 years, executes this system, it's locked tight, but maybe for the safety managers that don't necessarily have all their ducks in a row, right? And are dealing with this administrative burden, walk me through how SIM can help, those safety managers and those organizations. They're really trying to build that safety program.
Yeah, I agree totally with what you said. I think, companies can build a paper-based system that allows for their inspections to be executed on time, thoroughly, and define kind of routing methods for follow-up and addressing deficiencies noted, including retiring equipment. But it requires a constant vigilance, right? You almost have to be on top of it like on a daily basis. And oftentimes there's a lot of moving parts, which means there's a lot of folks that contribute to that type of program. And if those subtle changes happen within it, it can actually put the administration at risk. And so maybe one area is not doing them as frequently as they're supposed to. Maybe they're not as thorough as they're supposed to. Maybe they're not routing the follow-ups to the right location, etc. So it requires constant vigilance, but it can be done. What I think safety inspection manager does is it builds all of that vigilance into the digital world, right? So you create, the assets, you assign the inspections that you want to be completed for each of the assets. You assign who is the person, or what is the role of the person who performs that inspection, and then what is the frequency in which those inspections are performed, and then the system does that governance for you, and it's just a matter of you generating reports so that you have that oversight that the system is operating the way you want it to. I think that's the difference. So I think SIM is a tool to really take and relieve that administrative burden that it takes to have an excellent program, as just described.
Yeah, and I think the point I keep going back to these safety managers that are managing multiple locations. God bless you if you're listening to this, by the way. But it's got to be. This is a full-time 60, 70-hour job, right? To get this system built. And then the other part is managing that system, right? Especially, and it becomes compounding once you have multiple locations, right? So from a safety inspection management, I guess, software like Safety Inspection Manager or SIM, I guess talk to me a little bit how it really helps those guys, the guys that really have big shoes to fill. They have multiple locations they're trying to manage, and they have, not just 10 employees, right? But, they're managing hundreds, if not thousands of assets.
To the point you raised, right? So if safety engineers, that is a very intense job. And to be frank, there's a lot of operations folks that can be a part of that administrative responsibilities as well. It does require a pretty intense effort in order to make sure that you keep up with all of those inspections, the follow-ups, the frequency, the documentation, the retention, all of those things. Being able to transition all of those assets into digital inventory and be able to do the inspections, from your smartphone, and then be able to, as the administrator of the system, be able to go to the portal and easily access the dashboard that we're looking at here on the screen, be able to know the status of my inspections and how many failed, how many passed, or how many were delinquent, how many were done on time, routing directly to the follow-up actions, being able to track the follow-up actions, from this system. It just it makes their life so much easier.
Yeah, I know that you had mentioned one of the largest retailers in the world uses SIM daily. I mean, we're talking thousands of checklists and assets that need to be tracked, and tracking various worker training events, who's checked in and checked out. Equipment has saved something like 70% reduction in inspection related times, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, and potentially decreased or eliminated OSHA fines. But labor-related costs, reduced labor-related costs. You mentioned productivity and how critical it is for a lot of these organizations, especially these large organizations that are well into commercialization, right? Some of the largest organizations in the country, saving 70% of reduction just in inspection-related time. I mean, that's a significant metric.
I think that's a great point. So whether that results in kind of a labor efficiency and kind of reduced labor costs, or potentially that labor could be reallocated to proactive activities that drive more value across the organization. So it gives the business a lot of latitude to really take advantage of that.
How do I attach an ROI metric to this? Right? It's one thing saying, hey, I've saved time, right? But how do I equate time to dollars? At the end of the day, the guy that's in procurement that's trying to justify the cost of something like this, how can we get, or how can you justify the ROI for Safety Inspection Manager?
Well, I think there's a lot of components that go into it, and some of the components may be higher magnitude at some companies versus others, right? If you just look at the time and the resources required in order to, maintain the paper availability of the checklist out in the field, to actually go through and complete a checklist, on paper versus digitally, probably about the same time, not much difference there. But then you've got the whole put it in a file folder, send it up to stores, put it in a filing cabinet, a lots of different hands are touching this. So how do you actually kind of take advantage of that efficiency? Or maybe some companies actually take a step and they actually input it into an Excel spreadsheet. So now you've got the administrative time of transitioning from paper-based keyboard, into a system. And there's potential that exists there. So if you've got a unique identifiers on your equipment, maybe they get mistyped in the Excel spreadsheet. So there's opportunities for error. When you're using kind of a digital platform to do this, you're scanning a QR code or scanning an RFID tag, and you're reading the equipment right now. It's immediately on your screen. You pull up the digital checklist, you go through, you identify issues that may need follow up. You can take pictures of it, you can make notes, and then you complete the inspection, pass or fail. Notifications are immediately sent to the appropriate parties in order to either restore it in the digital kind of database or forward it to the right person to address the issues. That's pretty, when you sit there and you think about that in itself, that efficiency, that's the 70% more efficient to conduct the inspections. And then you look at the history of inspection related citations that might occur, based on an OSHA inspection or something like that. Then you look at deficiencies that contributed to, maybe an incident with injury or an incident without injury. What's the cost of that? I mean, so there's a tail of value that could be evaluated to establish what an ROI could be.
Yeah. Well, I know the cost of the software is less than the cost of a record keeping fine, let
That's right.
alone,
Yeah.
let alone your average OSHA fine. So, I mean, to me, it seems like a no brainer. And, I think one of the things that you also had mentioned is, one of the largest airlines, top 3 airlines in the world uses this, and they use it to check in and check out equipment actually. And it sounds like, what the problem that they ran into was they didn't know where their equipment was. They didn't know how it was being handled. And so there's equipment that, maybe ended up on eBay or one of these other sites. But now they have visibility into who's got equipment, who's checked in that equipment, who owns that equipment, and how are they using and handling that equipment.
And I would even add to that, the equipment that's being checked in and checked out is critical communications equipment for guiding airplanes into and out of gates. So having that equipment that's inspected properly and certified when it's given out to the employee to go perform their job on a shift is an additional risk mitigation, because now they're directing airplanes in and out of gates. You want to make sure that their headset and their hearing, their speakers are working the way they're supposed to, and they're able to verify that, and they've got records of all of that.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like a no-brainer. It's an insurance policy if you want to look at it like that from a risk standpoint.
Yeah,
this has been fun. Honestly, this has been fun. It's our first podcast, and it really brings us to the close of today's episode here at Aatmunn's Innovation Lab, where our passion is enhancing safety and the lives of 2 billion frontline workers across the globe. And we hope today's discussion not only informed, but also inspired to help you take the next steps at making warehouses, especially in safety protocols, an extension of workplace safety, and really hoping that you focus on building a safer and more productive environment for all. And if you're feeling motivated to contribute to a safer workplace, here's how you can get started. For our listeners tuning into YouTube, hit that subscribe button to stay updated with our latest discussions and insights from the Aatmunn Innovation Lab. If you're on LinkedIn, please give us a follow. We put a lot of time and effort in making sure that the content we put out there is not just content, but it's valuable content that has a backbone to it. And please share your thoughts on today's episode. We'd love to hear from you. And think it's time to see some tangible difference in your warehouse safety. Reach out to us for a personalized demo. Would love to run you through the application itself, how it can be used on any mobile device or on some sort of tablet or other industrial scanners that are out there in the market today that you might be using. And for more insights, please don't hesitate to connect with me, Corey Welch, or our esteemed guest and former U.S. Steel executive, Doug Matthews, on LinkedIn. You'll find our links in the description or comments below. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Your engagement and actions are really what truly drive a significant impact in workplace safety. So until next time, Stay safe, everybody. Let's keep momentum going.
Make it a safe day.
Make it a safe day. See you in the next episode.